The sun hung low over the Colorado Territory, painting the red rock formations in shades of copper and rust. It was the summer of 1863, and the vast expanse of the American West stretched endlessly beneath a cloudless sky. Sagebrush dotted the landscape, their silver-green leaves shimmering in the heat waves that rose from the baked earth. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains stood like ancient sentinels, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the season. Eleanor May Whitfield had known no other home than the small homestead nestled in the valley between two weathered hills. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that bloomed naturally in hardship sun-kissed skin, cornflower blue eyes that held both innocence and determination, and golden hair that she kept carefully braided despite the endless dust that seemed to settle on everything. Her calloused hands spoke of daily chores, milking their lone cow, tending the vegetable garden that struggled against the arid soil, and helping her father repair the endless damages wrought by wind and weather on their modest cabin. The Whitfield homestead was humble, a single-room structure built from rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and straw. A stone chimney rose from one end, and two small windows covered with oiled paper let in filtered light. Outside, a small corral held their 2 horses and the milk cow, while a chicken coop provided eggs when the hens were willing. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, carved from the wilderness by her parents' determination and sustained by their endless toil. Eleanor's mother had passed 3 winters ago from fever, leaving her and her father, Samuel, to manage alone. Samuel Whitfield was a man aged beyond his 45 years, his face carved with deep lines from squinting against the sun and weathering countless storms. He'd come west with dreams of gold, but settled for the more reliable, if meager, living of subsistence farming and occasional work at the nearby trading post. On this particular evening, Eleanor hummed softly as she prepared their simple supper of beans and cornbread. Her father sat at their rough-hewn table, cleaning his old Spencer rifle, a task he performed religiously each night. The familiar routine brought comfort in a land where danger could ride in with the wind. "Storm coming," Samuel muttered, glancing toward the window. "Feel it in my bones." Eleanor followed his gaze. The sky remained clear, but she'd learned to trust her father's instincts. In the West, those who survived longest were those who could read the subtle signs of trouble approaching. "I'll bring in extra firewood," she said, wiping her hands on her worn apron. "Good girl. And Eleanor." He paused, his weathered face grave. "Keep the rifle handy tonight." A chill ran down her spine despite the warm evening. Her father rarely showed concern so openly. As she stepped outside to gather wood, she scanned the horizon. Nothing seemed amiss. The usual hawks circled overhead, and a jackrabbit bounded through the sage. Yet something felt different, like the earth itself was holding its breath. The attack came just after midnight. Eleanor woke to the thunder of hooves and her father's shout. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness like deadly fireflies. She scrambled from her bedroll, reaching for the rifle kept beside her, but rough hands seized her before she could grasp it. "Got a pretty one here," a voice growled. The stench of whiskey and unwashed bodies filled her nostrils as she was dragged from the cabin. "Eleanor!" her father's voice rang out, followed by more gunshots. She fought wildly, kicking and clawing at her captors, but they were too many and too strong. In the chaos of flames, someone had set the chicken coop ablaze. She saw her father fall, his body crumpling near the doorway. "Papa!" Her scream tore through the night, raw and desperate. One of the raiders struck her across the face, and stars exploded across her vision. "Shut her up and get her in the wagon," commanded a cold voice. "She'll fetch a good price." Through her daze, Eleanor felt herself being bound, rough rope cutting into her wrists. They threw her into a wagon bed like a sack of grain. As consciousness faded, the last thing she saw was their cabin engulfed in flames, her entire world reduced to smoke and ash against the star-filled sky. When she awoke, the sun was high and merciless. The wagon jolted over rough terrain, each bump sending pain through her bruised body. Her hands were tied behind her back, and iron shackles heavy and rust-stained, encircled her ankles. The metal had already begun to chafe, promising worse agony to come. She wasn't alone in the wagon. 2 other figures lay nearby, a Mexican woman who stared at nothing with hollow eyes, and a young Native American girl who couldn't have been more than 15. Both wore the same shackles, the same look of despair. "Awake at last," sneered one of the riders, a man with greasy black hair and a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. "Thought we'd lost you to the angels." Eleanor tried to speak but found her throat parched and raw. The scarred man laughed and took a long drink from his canteen, water dripping down his stubbled chin, before turning away without offering her any. As the day wore on, the reality of her situation became horrifyingly clear. These weren't ordinary bandits. They were traders in human misery, gathering their merchandise to sell at some distant market where law and conscience held no sway. She'd heard whispered tales of such men at the trading post, stories dismissed as exaggeration. Now she knew better. The convoy consisted of 3 wagons and about a dozen riders, all armed and vigilant. They moved with the confidence of men who'd traveled this route before, who knew every hidden canyon and water source. Their leader, a man the others called Josiah Creed, rode a black stallion and wore twin Colt revolvers. His eyes, when they fell upon her, held the cold calculation of a man appraising goods. Nothing more. Days blurred together in a haze of heat, thirst, and pain. They were given just enough water to survive and a daily ration of hard biscuit that turned to paste in her dry mouth. At night, they remained shackled in the wagon while the men made camp, telling crude jokes and planning their profits. Eleanor learned to retreat into her mind, holding tight to memories of better times. Her mother's gentle hands teaching her to sew, her father's rare smile when the corn grew tall, Sunday picnics by the creek when water ran clear and cool. But these refuges grew harder to maintain as her body weakened and the shackles bit deeper into her flesh. One evening, as they camped near a dried riverbed lined with cottonwoods, she overheard Creed discussing their destination. "Fort Laramie's too risky now," he said, spitting tobacco juice into the fire. "Too many army patrols. We'll head south to Bent's Fort, then follow the old Spanish trail. Plenty of buyers in the territories who don't ask questions." "What about the Apache?" asked another man nervously. "Heard they've been raiding along that route." Creed's laugh was humorless. "Apache are bad for business." "True enough, but they know better than to attack our outfit. We've got an understanding." Eleanor's heart sank. If even the fierce Apache wouldn't challenge these men, what hope did she have? She looked down at her shackles, the iron heavy and unyielding. In her old life, she'd been free without truly knowing what freedom meant. Now, bound like livestock, she understood its value with agonizing clarity. The other women in the wagon had retreated into their own silences. The Mexican woman, Elena, she'd learned, had been taken from her family's ranch. The native girl never spoke, but her eyes burned with a fury that hadn't yet been extinguished. Eleanor wondered how long her own spirit would last before breaking entirely. As another day dawned over the desolate landscape, painting the rocks and sand in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor closed her eyes and did something she hadn't done since her mother's death. She prayed, not for rescue, which seemed impossible, but for strength to endure whatever lay ahead. In this vast, indifferent wilderness, even hope felt like rebellion, and she clung to it with the desperation of the drowning, knowing it might be all that separated her from the abyss. The convoy had grown larger. 3 days into their hellish journey, Creed's men had rendezvoused with another group of traders near a place they called Devil's Canyon. Eleanor watched through swollen eyes as more wagons joined their grim procession, carrying human cargo from raids across the territory. The new arrivals included a group of Chinese laborers taken from railroad camps, several Mexican vaqueros, and a handful of Native Americans from various tribes. Among the new captives, one figure stood out even in his bondage. The Lakota warrior sat motionless in the wagon ahead of Eleanor's, his bearing unbowed despite the heavy chains that bound him. Unlike the shackles on the others, His restraints were doubled, thick iron at wrists and ankles, connected by shorter lengths of chain that forced him to remain hunched. Even the traders seemed wary of him, keeping their distance when they threw water or food into his wagon. Eleanor couldn't see his face clearly from her position, but she noticed how he never begged or cried out like some of the others. His silence held a quality different from despair. It was the silence of a predator waiting, watching, calculating. The guards had stripped him of his weapons and traditional dress, forcing him into rough cotton pants and leaving his broad chest bare. But they couldn't strip him of the dangerous dignity that clung to him like a second skin. The expanded convoy now numbered over 30 captives and twice as many guards. They moved like a small army through the desert, raising clouds of red dust that coated everything. Eleanor's world had shrunk to the dimensions of the wagon bed, the weight of her shackles, and the endless thirst that clawed at her throat. "Water," Elena whispered beside her. Her voice cracked like dried leather. "Por favor. Agua." One of the younger guards, a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, glanced their way. For a moment, Eleanor saw something like pity flicker across his face. He started toward them with his canteen, but Creed's voice cracked like a whip. "Leave them be. Tommy, they get water at the scheduled times. No more. But Mr. Creed, they're suffering. Suffering builds character," Creed said coldly. "Besides, damaged goods sell for less. They'll survive until the next water stop." The boy, Tommy, retreated, but not before Eleanor caught his troubled glance. Perhaps not all of these men were entirely lost to cruelty. She filed this observation away, though she had no idea how it might help her. The landscape changed as they traveled. The high desert gave way to a maze of canyons and arroyos, where ancient waters had carved fantastic shapes from stone. Saguaro cacti stood like giant sentinels, their arms raised to the cloudless sky. At night, coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing off canyon walls in an eerie chorus. It was during one of these night camps that Eleanor first heard the Lakota warrior speak. The guards had made the mistake of placing his wagon too close to their campfire, perhaps thinking the light would make it easier to watch him. As the men drank and gambled, their attention wavered. "You are stronger than you know," he said quietly, in accented but clear English. His words seemed directed at no one in particular, but Eleanor felt them pierce through her despair. The body can be chained, but the spirit remembers the sky. A guard noticed and struck the wagon bars with his rifle butt. "Shut your mouth, savage, or I'll shut it permanent-like." The warrior fell silent, but Eleanor carried his words with her like a small flame in the darkness. The spirit remembers the sky. She looked up at the vast expanse of stars overhead, so bright in the clear desert air that they seemed close enough to touch. Somewhere beneath those same stars, people lived free. The thought was both comfort and torture. Days passed in a blur of heat and misery. They crossed dried riverbeds where the horses' hooves kicked up alkali dust that burned the lungs. Barrel cacti and ocotillo dotted the landscape, and occasionally they passed the bleached bones of cattle or horses that hadn't survived the journey. Eleanor began to wonder if her own bones would join them. The casual cruelty of their captors became routine. Women who cried too loudly were gagged. Men who showed defiance were beaten. The message was clear. They were no longer people but property, and property didn't require kindness. Eleanor watched as the light died in the eyes of some captives, their spirits breaking under the relentless dehumanization. But not all surrendered. The young native girl in Eleanor's wagon, she'd learned her name was Sarah, given by missionaries before she was taken, maintained a fierce watchfulness. And the Lakota warrior, despite his heavier restraints, seemed to burn with an inner fire that no amount of brutality could extinguish. One scorching afternoon, as they navigated a particularly treacherous canyon pass, disaster nearly struck. One of the wagons lost a wheel, sending it careening dangerously close to the edge of a steep drop. The captives inside screamed as the wagon tilted, threatening to plummet into the ravine below. "Cut them loose," Tommy shouted. "They'll all die if it goes over. "Leave them," Creed commanded. "No one breaks formation." But the young guard ignored him, leaping from his horse to hack at the wagon's restraints with a knife. Other guards joined him, more from practical concern about losing valuable merchandise than compassion. In the chaos, Eleanor noticed the Lakota warrior testing his chains, muscles straining against the iron. For just a moment, one of his shackles seemed to give, the metal groaning under the pressure of his strength. Then order was restored. The wagon was pulled back from the brink, the captive secured once more. But Eleanor had seen something in that moment of chaos. The warrior's chains weren't as indestructible as they seemed. Hope, that dangerous emotion she'd tried to suppress, flickered to life again. That night, they camped in a box canyon with high walls that trapped the day's heat like an oven. The guards seemed more relaxed, believing the natural fortress made escape impossible. Eleanor watched as they passed around bottles of whiskey, their vigilance dulling with each drink. The moon rose full and bright, turning the canyon into a landscape of silver and shadow. Eleanor lay wakefully, her body exhausted but her mind racing. Through the wagon bars, she could see the Lakota warrior in profile, his face finally visible in the moonlight. Strong features carved by wind and sun, eyes that held depths of pain and determination in equal measure. He was perhaps 30 years old, in the prime of his strength despite the captivity. As if sensing her gaze, he turned slightly. Their eyes met across the distance between wagons, and in that shared glance, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. They were from different worlds, spoke different languages, worshipped different gods. Yet, in this moment, they were united by chains, by suffering, by the desperate desire for freedom that no amount of iron could fully contain. The warrior nodded almost imperceptibly, then looked meaningfully at the guards, most of whom were now deep in their cups. His message was clear. Their captor's cruelty might be their weakness. Those who viewed others as less than human often failed to see the full measure of their prisoner's humanity, their intelligence, their will to survive. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling tears slide down her dust-caked cheeks. She had been raised to fear Indians, taught they were savage and cruel. Yet here, in the depths of her despair, it was a Lakota warrior who reminded her that her spirit could still soar above her chains. The irony wasn't lost on her. Those her people called savage showed more humanity than the civilized men who traded in human misery. Tomorrow would bring more heat, more thirst, more degradation. But tonight, under the vast western sky, Eleanor Whitfield allowed herself to remember who she had been and dream of who she might yet become. The chains on her body were heavy, but somewhere deep inside, her spirit began to test its own bonds, remembering what it meant to be free. The frontier town of Bitter Creek sprawled like a festering wound against the landscape. After 2 weeks of brutal travel, the convoy rolled down the main street, raising clouds of dust that mixed with the stench of horse manure, rotting garbage, and human misery. False-fronted buildings lined the thoroughfare saloons, gambling halls, a hotel that rented rooms by the hour, and various establishments that catered to the basest human appetites. Eleanor had never seen such a place. Even the rough trading posts she'd known seemed civilized compared to this lawless settlement. Men staggered drunkenly between buildings, some still wearing their mining gear, others dressed in the flashy attire of professional gamblers. Women in paint and feathers called from balconies, their voices harsh with forced gaiety. And everywhere, the sound of violence barely contained breaking glass, angry shouts, the occasional gunshot that no one seemed to investigate. Creed had chosen this place deliberately. Here, no one asked questions about wagon loads of chained humans. Here, money talked louder than conscience, and the law was whatever man had the fastest gun and the willingness to use it. The convoy stopped in a large courtyard behind a warehouse at the town's edge. Eleanor watched through exhausted eyes as Creed negotiated with a heavy-set man in a stained velvet vest who kept mopping his sweating face despite the evening cool. $20 for the Mexican women, $30 for the white girl, the man was saying. examining the captives like a livestock. "The Chinamen. I can move for 15 each, but that Indian," he gestured toward the Lakota warrior's wagon. "That's trouble I don't need. He's strong as 3 men," Creed argued. "Perfect for the mines. Strong enough to snap a man's neck. More like, I'll give you 10 for him. And that's being generous." As they haggled over human lives, Eleanor felt her stomach turn. She'd known she was bound for slavery, but hearing her worth reduced to dollars and cents made it real in a way that cut deeper than any chain. The captives were herded into the warehouse, a vast space that stank of old sweat and fear. Iron cages lined the walls, some already occupied by hollow-eyed people who'd learned not to hope. Men were separated from women, though the division seemed more about preventing unified resistance than any concern for modesty. Eleanor found herself shoved into a cage with Elena and Sarah, along with 2 new arrivals, Chinese women who spoke no English but whose eyes conveyed universal terror. The cage was meant for perhaps 3 people. With 5, they could barely move without touching each other. Through the bars, she could see the Lakota warrior being forced into a reinforced cell clearly built for dangerous prisoners. It took 6 men to move him, and even then, he nearly broke free when one guard got too close. A rifle butt to the head finally subdued him, and they locked him in, adding extra chains for good measure. "Magnificent specimen," she heard someone say. A well-dressed man had entered the warehouse, his clothing marking him as someone of means even in this rough town. "How much for the savage?" "He's not for general sale." "Mr. Thornton," the warehouse owner replied nervously. "Special buyer coming tomorrow, already paid in advance." Thornton's eyes swept the cages, lingering on Eleanor. "And the white girl?" "Auction tomorrow noon. Expected to fetch a good price. She's still got her looks, despite the journey." Eleanor shrank back, trying to make herself invisible, but Thornton's gaze had already catalogued her like an item in a shop window, the casual discussion of her sale, as if she were nothing more than goods to be bartered, struck her anew with the horror of her situation. Night in the warehouse was a symphony of human misery. Sobs, prayers in various languages, the rattle of chains as people shifted trying to find comfort on the hard floor. Eleanor dozed fitfully, jerking awake each time footsteps approached, fearing what new torment might come. Near dawn, she heard a sound different from the usual nighttime chorus, a low, rhythmic chanting. It came from the Lakota warrior's cell, words in his native language that seemed to push against the very walls that contained him. Some of the guards shouted for him to stop, but the chanting continued, growing stronger. "What's he saying?" Eleanor whispered to Sarah. The girl listened intently, though from a different tribe. She seemed to understand some of the words. "He sings of the eagle," she whispered back, "of wind and sky and freedom. He tells the spirits he is not broken." One of the guards, driven to fury by the defiant chanting, grabbed a bucket of filthy water and threw it through the bars. The warrior's voice never faltered, though now it came through chattering teeth as the cold water soaked his already minimal clothing. Morning brought new horrors. The captives were hauled out one by one, made to stand on a raised platform while potential buyers examined them. Eleanor watched as Elena was prodded and poked, made to turn in circles while men discussed her potential for various forms of labor. The dehumanization was complete. They weren't even trying to maintain the pretense that these were people rather than property. When Eleanor's turn came, her legs barely supported her. The platform faced the main street, and a small crowd had gathered, some genuinely interested buyers, others just there for the spectacle. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, trying to transport her mind elsewhere, while voices discussed her teeth, her build, her probable endurance. "Genuine white woman, folks," the auctioneer called out. "Taken in a raid just 2 weeks past, still fresh, still strong, ideal for domestic service or other duties." The crowd's laughter made Eleanor's skin crawl. She caught sight of Tommy, the young guard, at the edge of the gathering. His face was troubled, guilt written plainly across his features. But he did nothing, said nothing, just another silent witness to the degradation. "She'd clean up nice," someone called out. What's the starting bid? $50 to start? Do I hear 50? 50! The bid came from Thornton, the well-dressed man from the night before. 60! Another voice, belonging to a woman who ran one of the town's establishments. 75! Thornton again, his tone suggesting he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. The bidding continued, each increase another nail in Eleanor's coffin. She swayed on the platform, the noon sun beating down mercilessly. Through her despair, she heard that low chanting again, the Lakota warrior, invisible in his cell but making his presence known. His defiance in the face of utter powerlessness stirred something in Eleanor's chest. $120. Thornton's final bid silenced the competition. Sold to Mr. Thornton! Come claim your property, sir! As hands reached for her, Eleanor did something that surprised even her. She spat in Thornton's face, mustering every ounce of saliva her parched mouth could produce. The crowd gasped. Thornton's face darkened with rage, and he raised his hand to strike her. I wouldn't damage your new purchase, Mr. Thornton, Creed drawled from nearby. You break it. You bought it, as they say. Thornton lowered his hand but leaned close to Eleanor. You'll learn manners soon enough, girl. I have ways of teaching respect. They dragged her back to the cage to await transfer to her new owner. But something had changed. The other women looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear. Even some of the male captives had seen her small act of rebellion. And from the reinforced cell, the chanting grew louder, as if in approval. Eleanor slumped against the bars, knowing she would pay dearly for her defiance. But for one moment, she had remembered she was human, not property. She had chosen to act, even if the only choice available was to spit in the face of her oppressor. The afternoon wore on, thick with tension and heat. More auctions, more sales, more lives destroyed. Eleanor watched it all through iron bars, wondering if this would be her last day in this particular hell before being transported to a new one. The Lakota warrior had fallen silent, but she felt his presence like a storm building on the horizon. As the sun began its descent, painting the warehouse walls in shades of blood and gold, Eleanor closed her eyes and made a vow. Whatever came next, whatever degradation awaited, she would not let them break her spirit completely. Somewhere out there, beyond these walls and chains, the eagle still flew free, and as long as she drew breath, some part of her would remember what it meant to soar. The chains on her ankles had worn through skin to flesh, each movement agony, but pain meant she was still alive, still feeling, still human despite their best efforts to prove otherwise. And in this place where humanity was bought and sold, that knowledge felt like its own small victory. The convoy departed Bitter Creek before dawn, smaller now after the auction but still substantial. Eleanor found herself in a different wagon, separated from Elena and Sarah, who'd been sold to other buyers. Her new traveling companions included 2 Mexican women and a Negro man who'd been captured somewhere in Texas. They all wore the same expression, the hollow look of those who'd seen their lives stripped away piece by piece. Thornton rode alongside in a fine carriage, having decided to accompany his purchase personally rather than trust her to the traders. Eleanor could feel his eyes on her through the wagon bars, possessive and calculating. She'd learned he owned a large ranch near the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where he needed domestic workers, a term that covered a multitude of sins. The Lakota warrior remained with the convoy, his buyer apparently planning to collect him at a point further along the trail. They'd moved him to a special prison wagon, little more than an iron box on wheels with small air holes. Even so, the guards remained nervous around it, as if expecting him to burst free through sheer force of will. The landscape grew more treacherous as they left the relative flatlands behind. The trail wound through narrow canyons where the walls rose like prison bars made of stone, through patches of desert where nothing grew but thorny ocotillo and stubborn creosote. The autumn sun still carried fierce heat during the day, but the nights grew cold, leaving the captives shivering in their thin clothing. 3 days out from Bitter Creek, the weather turned. Eleanor watched dark clouds mass on the horizon. moving in with unnatural speed. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and something else, the electric tension that preceded violent storms. "Storm coming fast," one of the outriders called. "Need to find shelter?" Creed consulted with his men, then pointed toward a cluster of massive rock formations ahead. "There, those overhangs will give us cover." The convoy pushed hard to reach the rocks before the storm hit, but they were only halfway there when the skies opened. It wasn't ordinary rain, but a deluge. Sheets of water that turned the trail to mud within minutes. Lightning cracked overhead. So close the thunder was instantaneous, deafening. The horses panicked. One wagon slid sideways on the muddy trail, tilting dangerously. Thornton's carriage driver fought to control his team as they reared and plunged. In the chaos, Eleanor saw opportunity, not for escape. Her chains made that impossible, but for something else. The prison wagon holding the Lakota warrior had been left momentarily unguarded as men rushed to control the sliding wagons. Through the driving rain, Eleanor saw him pressed against the bars of his mobile cell, testing them as he had before. This time, with the wagon's frame stressed by the tilting and sliding. Something gave. A bar bent, just slightly. Then another. The warrior's muscles strained visibly as he worked at the weakness, his powerful hands gripping and pulling with calculated force. Eleanor held her breath, willing him to succeed even as she knew it might mean nothing for her own fate. A brilliant lightning strike illuminated the scene in stark relief, the warrior halfway through the bent bars. His body contorted as he forced himself through an impossibly small opening. Then, darkness again, and shouts of alarm. "The savage is loose! The savage is—" The guard's warning cut off abruptly. In the storm's fury, Eleanor caught glimpses of movement, the warrior free but still hampered by his chains, fighting with the desperate strength of a man who knew this might be his only chance. He moved like his name suggested, fluid and deadly despite the iron that bound him. More lightning revealed him grappling with two guards, using his chains as weapons, the heavy links becoming instruments of his liberation. Other guards tried to take aim, but the rain and chaos made shooting dangerous. They were as likely to hit their own men as their target. Eleanor watched transfixed as the warrior fought his way toward the wagon horses. If he could mount one, chains or no chains, he might have a chance in this storm. But there were too many guards, and his chains slowed him. She saw him go down under multiple attackers, saw rifles raised to end his rebellion permanently. "No!" The scream tore from Eleanor's throat without thought. "Let him be!" Her cry distracted the guards for just a moment, their attention swinging to her wagon. It was enough. The warrior surged up from beneath his attackers, breaking free once more. But instead of running for the horses, he turned toward the captive wagons. He reached Eleanor's wagon in 3 powerful strides, his hands gripping the lock mechanism. The guards shouted, closing in, but the warrior ignored them. His eyes met Eleanor's through the bars, dark eyes that held a universe of pain and determination. "Freedom," he said in accented English, that one word carrying the weight of mountains. Then he gripped the lock with both hands and pulled. The lock was strong, made to hold desperate people, but the warrior's strength was beyond normal human limits. Fueled by fury and desperation and something more, a need to strike even the smallest blow against those who traded in human misery. The metal groaned, protested, then snapped. The wagon door swung open. Eleanor stared in shock, unable to process what was happening. The warrior reached in, his powerful hands closing around her chains. For a moment that stretched like eternity. Their eyes locked again. Then he gripped the chains that bound her ankles and pulled. The sound of breaking iron rang out like a bell even above the storm's roar. The chain links, weakened by weeks of rust and wear, parted under his inhuman strength. Eleanor's ankles were still shackled, but she was no longer bound to the wagon. "Run!" the warrior commanded, already turning to the other captives. "Run now!" Gunfire erupted. The warrior staggered as a bullet found its mark, blood blooming across his bare chest, but he didn't fall. Instead, He grabbed the chains of the Negro man, snapping them as he had Eleanor's. Another shot, another wound, but still he stood, freeing one more captive before his strength began to fail. Eleanor half fell, half jumped from the wagon, her legs weak but adrenaline lending her strength. The storm raged around them, turning the world into a chaos of wind and water. She saw the warrior go to one knee, saw guards closing in, and made a decision that came from somewhere deeper than thought. She grabbed a rock heavy, jagged, and brought it down on the nearest guard's head. He dropped, and she seized his pistol. Though her chained hands made it awkward to hold, "Get back!" she screamed at the other guards, waving the weapon wildly. She had no idea if she could actually shoot anyone, but the threat was enough to make them hesitate. The warrior looked up at her, surprise flickering across his pain-etched features, then something that might have been approval. Using the distraction, he lurched to his feet and stumbled toward the rocks, Eleanor and 2 other freed captives following. They made it perhaps 50 yards before Eleanor heard Thornton's voice cutting through the storm. "Shoot them all if you have to, but get my property back." Bullets whined past, striking sparks from the rocks. The warrior stumbled again, and Eleanor saw he was leaving a trail of blood already being washed away by the rain. Without thinking, she moved to support him, her shoulder under his arm, though he was nearly twice her weight. "Cannot make it," he gasped. "You go." "No." Eleanor's voice was fierce. "You broke my chains. We go together or not at all." They struggled on through mud and rain, the shouts of pursuit growing closer. The rocky overhang loomed ahead, promising at least temporary shelter. Just a little further. The warrior's legs gave out completely. He collapsed, dragging Eleanor down with him. She looked back to see guards approaching, Creed at their head, his face twisted with rage. This was the end. Then, at least she would die free, if only for these few moments. Then hoofbeats, but not from behind. Riders emerged from the rocks ahead, moving fast despite the storm. For a heart-stopping moment, Eleanor thought they were more of Creed's men, cutting off their escape. But these riders wore no white man's clothing. Apache warriors, painted for war, their arrival turning the scene into something from Creed's nightmares. The guards scattered, suddenly outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Gunfire erupted from both sides, the storm adding to the chaos. Eleanor felt strong hands lifting her, saw the Lakota warrior being carefully raised by 2 Apache braves. Her last coherent sight before exhaustion claimed her was Creed's face, twisted with fury as his human merchandise disappeared into the storm, stolen by the very savages he dismissed as beneath notice. Thunder crashed overhead like the laughter of ancient gods, washing away the tracks of their escape. While behind them the bitter business of human trafficking met the harsh justice of the desert. The rain fell like a curtain between Eleanor's old life and whatever lay ahead, and she surrendered to it gladly, her broken chains singing freedom's song with every movement. Eleanor awoke to the sound of water trickling over stone and the soft murmur of voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. For a moment, panic seized her. Where was she? Then memory flooded back. The storm, the escape, the Apache riders. She lay still, taking stock. She was on something soft, blankets or furs, and wonderfully warm. Her ankles still bore the iron cuffs, but the chains connecting them were gone. Opening her eyes carefully, she found herself in a cave. Firelight dancing on stone walls decorated with ancient paintings. The Apache who had rescued them were gone, but she wasn't alone. The Lakota warrior lay on another bed of furs nearby, his chest wrapped in cloth bandages spotted with blood. His eyes were closed, but his breathing seemed steady. "You wake." The voice made her start. A figure emerged from the shadows, an elderly native woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes. "Drink," she said in accented English, offering a gourd of water. Eleanor drank greedily, the cool water soothing her parched throat. Where are we?" "Safe," the woman replied simply. "Hidden place. Apache no, but Apache friends. They bring you, then go. Too dangerous to stay." "The warrior," Eleanor gestured toward the wounded man. "Is he? Strong, will heal. Bullets pass through. No, stay inside. Lucky! The woman studied Eleanor with sharp intelligence. You help him. Risk life for him. Why? He not your people. Eleanor considered the question. Why indeed? He freed me, she said finally. When he could have just saved himself, he broke my chains. I couldn't let him die for that kindness. The old woman nodded slowly. Good answer. My grandson. He say you different from other whites. Say you have brave heart. She gestured to the paintings on the cave walls. This sacred place, old spirits live here. They judge who may stay, who must go. You may stay. Over the following days, Eleanor learned their sanctuary was a hidden canyon deep in the mountains, accessible only through a narrow passage, easily defended. A small stream provided fresh water, and the caves offered protection from the elements. The old woman, who said to call her grandmother Moon, was a healer who lived here alone, tending to those who needed sanctuary. The Lakota warrior, she learned his name was Dakota, meaning friend to everyone, remained unconscious for 2 days. Eleanor found herself constantly checking on him, watching the rise and fall of his chest, changing the poultices grandmother Moon showed her how to make. She owed this man her freedom, possibly her life. The least she could do was help tend his wounds. On the 3rd day, his eyes opened, dark eyes that held pain but also clarity. He looked around slowly, taking in the cave, the paintings, and finally Eleanor sitting beside him with a bowl of herbal broth. You, he said, his voice hoarse. You are safe. Thanks to you, Eleanor replied, helping him sit up enough to drink. Though I think we're even now. I hit a guard with a rock for you. The ghost of a smile crossed his stern features. Brave for a white woman, foolish, but brave. As Dakota recovered, they began to talk, slowly at first, with long silences between words, but gradually the stories emerged. He told her of his people, the Lakota, and how he'd been captured while scouting alone, sold by enemy tribes to the white traders. He spoke of the Black Hills, sacred to his people, and of a way of life being systematically destroyed by the endless wave of settlers. Eleanor shared her own story, the small homestead, her father's death, the nightmare journey in chains. She found herself crying as she spoke, months of suppressed grief finally breaking free. Dakota didn't offer empty comfort, just listened with grave attention. And somehow that was exactly what she needed. Grandmother Moon taught them both as they healed. She showed Eleanor which plants could heal and which could harm, how to find water in the desert, how to read the signs of coming weather. To Dakota, she spoke in his own language, and Eleanor could see him drinking in her words like a man dying of thirst. She teaches him the old ways. Grandmother Moon explained to Eleanor one evening, things his own grandmothers would teach, but he'd taken young from tribe, lost much time. As the days passed, Eleanor felt herself changing. The soft woman who had tended house and cooked meals seemed like a stranger now. This new Eleanor could start a fire with flint and steel, knew which cacti held water, could move silently through the rocks like a shadow. The iron cuffs still circled her ankles. Grandmother Moon's tools couldn't break them, but she learned to move despite them, wrapping them in cloth to muffle their sound. Dakota grew stronger daily, and with strength came restlessness. He would stand at the canyon entrance for hours, watching the sky, testing his healing body with increasingly demanding exercises. Eleanor understood. He needed to return to his people, to warn them about the traders, to resume his life as a warrior. One evening, as the sun painted the canyon walls gold and crimson, they sat together by the stream. The silence between them had become comfortable, no longer needing constant words to fill it. You will leave soon, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. My people need warning. The traders grow bolder. Soon they will raid the villages directly, not just take lone scouts. He paused, skipping a stone across the water. You could come. Eleanor's heart leaped, then fell. A white woman in a Lakota village? Your people would never accept me. You are not like other whites. You see us as human. That is rare, but not enough. Eleanor said sadly, "Your people have lost too much to welcome one of their destroyers, no matter how different I might be." Lakota didn't deny it. They both knew the truth. The divide between their peoples ran deep as the canyon they sheltered in, carved by years of blood and betrayal. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I don't know. I can't go back. I'm legally dead, sold as property. Thornton will have papers saying he owns me." She touched the iron cuffs on her ankles. "And these mark me as escaped property. Any town I enter, I risk being captured again." "Then stay here. Grandmother Moon would welcome the company." Eleanor considered it. The canyon was peaceful, safe, a world apart from the violence outside. But something in her rebelled against hiding forever. "Maybe for a while, until I figure out what comes next." That night, she woke to find Lakota sitting by the dying fire, carefully working on something in his hands. As she watched, he held up his creation, a small pouch made from deer hide, decorated with beads in a pattern that seemed to dance in the firelight. "For you," he said simply, handing it to her. "Medicine pouch, for protection." Eleanor took it reverently, feeling the soft leather, the careful beadwork. Inside was a small piece of turquoise, an eagle feather, and other items she couldn't identify. "I have nothing to give you in return." "You gave me freedom. You gave me life. This," he gestured to the pouch, "is small thing." But Eleanor knew it wasn't small. She'd learned enough to understand that such pouches were sacred, personal, not given lightly. She tied it around her neck, feeling its weight against her heart. The next morning, Lakota prepared to leave. Grandmother Moon gave him supplies: dried meat, water, herbs for his still healing wounds. Eleanor wanted to help but found herself frozen, unwilling to aid his departure even though she knew it was necessary. At the canyon entrance, he turned back. The morning sun lit his face, showing the new scars that would forever mark his time in chains. "Eleanor Whitfield," he said formally, "you are warrior woman now, not victim, not property. Warrior, remember this." "Lakota," she replied, his name feeling strange and right on her tongue. "Thank you for my freedom." He stepped closer, reaching out to touch the medicine pouch at her throat. "In my language, we say mitakuya oyasin. It means all my relations. We are all connected. Human, animal, earth, sky. You and I. We are connected now. Chain may be broken, but connection remains." Then he was gone, moving through the narrow passage and disappearing into the wider world, leaving Eleanor standing in the morning light, her hand clutched around the medicine pouch, feeling simultaneously more alone and less alone than she'd ever been in her life. Retried. Life in the canyon continued peacefully for several weeks after Lakota's departure. Eleanor threw herself into learning from Grandmother Moon, finding solace in the daily routines of survival. But she knew this sanctuary was temporary. Creed and Thornton wouldn't give up easily. She represented not just lost property, but wounded pride. Men like them couldn't tolerate being bested by a woman and a savage. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp autumn morning. Eleanor was gathering herbs near the canyon entrance when she heard it. Horses, many of them, moving through the rocky terrain beyond. She pressed herself against the stone wall, heart pounding, as voices drifted through the narrow passage. "The trail goes cold here, Mr. Thornton, like they just vanished into the rock." "People don't vanish," Thornton's cultured voice replied coldly. "Search every cave, every crevice. They're here somewhere." Eleanor crept back to warn Grandmother Moon, but the old woman was already packing essential supplies with practiced efficiency. "Not first time men come hunting," she said calmly. "Canyon has many secrets. Come." She led Eleanor deeper into the caves, through passages so narrow they had to turn sideways, down natural stone steps worn smooth by ancient waters. The sound of the searchers faded as they descended into the earth's heart. Finally, they emerged into a vast cavern lit by shafts of sunlight from cracks high above. An underground pool reflected the light like black glass. Sacred place. Grandmother Moon whispered. Older than memory. We wait here. They spent 3 days in the deep caves, living on dried food and spring water, listening to the distant echoes of men searching above. Eleanor learned that the canyon was honeycombed with passages, some leading to dead ends, others opening miles away. Grandmother Moon knew them all, had spent decades mapping this underground world. On the 3rd night, as they huddled by a small fire that wouldn't give away their position, Grandmother Moon spoke of things she rarely mentioned. Your warrior. He reaches people safely. Apache runners bring word. Eleanor's heart lifted at the news. He's not my warrior. The old woman's knowing smile said otherwise. You think connection ends with distance? No. Some bonds. They stretch like spider silk, invisible but strong. When they finally emerged, they found the upper canyon ransacked but empty. Thornton's men had vented their frustration on Grandmother Moon's dwelling, destroying what they couldn't steal. The old woman surveyed the damage without visible emotion, then began the patient work of rebuilding. Why don't you hate them? Eleanor asked, helping to salvage what they could. They destroy everything you've built. Hate is poison you drink hoping others die. Grandmother Moon replied, I choose different medicine. But Eleanor couldn't achieve such equanimity. The violation of their sanctuary ignited a fire in her chest. Not just fear now, but anger. She was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being hunted like an animal. That night, she made a decision. Teach me to fight, she told Grandmother Moon. Not just to run or hide, but to fight. The old woman studied her for a long moment. Fighting not always answer, but knowing how to fight, that gives choice. Yes, I teach. The training was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced. It wasn't about brute strength. She would never match a man there, but about using an opponent's force against them, about speed and precision, about knowing where the human body was vulnerable. Grandmother Moon had her practice with the knife until she could draw and strike in one fluid motion. Taught her to use the iron cuffs on her ankles as weapons rather than merely enduring them as burdens. You small. They think you weak, Grandmother Moon explained. This your advantage. Let them think this until too late. Eleanor also learned to shoot properly. She'd handled guns on the homestead, but that was different from combat shooting. Using an old revolver Grandmother Moon had hidden, she practiced until she could reliably hit targets even while moving, even with her heart racing from exertion. 2 months passed this way. Winter crept into the canyon, bringing cold nights and occasional snow. Eleanor felt herself hardening like steel tempered in fire. The soft homesteader's daughter was gone completely now, replaced by someone who could survive anything the frontier threw at her. Then came the day when everything changed again. Eleanor was hunting rabbits in the outer canyon when she heard horses approaching fast. She melted into the rocks, hand on her knife, but relaxed slightly when she saw it was a lone rider, an Apache warrior she recognized as one of their occasional visitors. His news was urgent. A large group of captives was being moved through Devil's Pass, 2 days' ride south. Among them were women and children from various tribes, taken in recent raids. The Apache planned to attack the convoy, but they were outnumbered. They needed every fighter they could get. Eleanor's first instinct was to stay hidden, safe, but then she thought of the captives. Imagined them in chains as she had been, hoping desperately for rescue that might never come. I'll go, she heard herself say. Grandmother Moon didn't try to stop her. Instead, she helped Eleanor prepare ammunition for the revolver, a good knife, supplies for hard riding. As Eleanor saddled one of the horses the Apache had brought, the old woman pressed something into her hand, a war paint mixture. You ride to war. You mark yourself as warrior. Let them see you choose to fight. Eleanor applied the paint with steady hands, dark lines across her cheekbones, a symbol on her forehead that Grandmother Moon showed her. When she looked at her reflection in the water trough, she barely recognized herself. Good. The Eleanor who looked back was someone who had survived chains and pursuit, who had learned to fight back. This was who she needed to be now. The ride to Devil's Pass tested every skill she'd learned. They moved fast through rough terrain, stopping only to rest the horses. Eleanor rode with 5 Apache warriors, and gradually she realized they had accepted her presence without question. Grandmother Moon's word carried that much weight. They made camp the first night in a sheltered grove, around the small fire. The warriors shared their plan. The convoy would have to slow going through the pass. That's where they'd strike. Quick, hard, free as many as possible before reinforcements arrived. "You not obligated," one warrior told Eleanor in broken English. "This Apache fight." "No," Eleanor replied firmly. "This is everyone's fight. Those chains don't care what color you are." She slept fitfully that night, dreaming of iron bonds and Dakota's hands breaking them. When she woke before dawn, her resolve had only strengthened. She checked her weapons one more time, touched the medicine pouch at her throat, and mounted up with the others. The second day's ride brought them to a ridge overlooking Devil's Pass. Below, winding through the narrow canyon like a serpent, was the convoy. Eleanor's stomach turned at the familiar sight. The prison wagons, the chained figures stumbling behind horses, the mounted guards with their rifles and whips. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't in chains. This time, she was armed, trained, and riding with warriors who knew how to fight. This time, she had a chance to be the miracle someone down there was praying for. As the sun reached its zenith, they prepared for battle. Eleanor checked her revolver one last time, adjusted her knife, and tried to calm her racing heart. Below, the convoy entered the narrowest part of the pass, where the walls rose sheer on both sides and there was nowhere to run. One of the Apache warriors raised his rifle, sighting on the lead guard. Eleanor took aim at another, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. In moments, the quiet afternoon would explode into violence. But for now, in this last breath before battle, she thought of Dakota, somewhere out there with his people, and hoped he would be proud of the warrior woman she had become. The signal came, a hawk's cry that wasn't from any bird. Eleanor squeezed the trigger, her shot ringing out in unison with the others, and the battle for Devil's Pass began. The first volley of gunfire echoed through Devil's Pass like thunder. Eleanor's shot found its mark. The guard toppled from his horse, clutching his shoulder. Around her, Apache rifles cracked in deadly harmony, throwing the convoy into instant chaos. "Push forward," the Apache war leader shouted in his language, and Eleanor understood enough to follow as they rode hard down the slope. The guards scrambled for cover, but the narrow pass offered little protection. Some dove behind wagons, others tried to control their panicking horses while returning fire. Eleanor rode low against her horse's neck, bullets whistling past like angry hornets. As they closed the distance, she saw him, Josiah Creed, very much alive and shouting orders from behind an overturned supply wagon. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and she saw recognition dawn on his scarred face, followed by murderous rage. "The white girl!" he roared. "Kill her! Kill them all!" Eleanor wheeled her horse sharply as Creed raised his rifle. The shot missed by inches, and she returned fire, forcing him back into cover. But more guards were rallying now, forming defensive positions. The element of surprise was fading. That's when she heard it, a war cry that made her heart leap. From the opposite ridge, more riders appeared. Lakota warriors, painted for battle, thundering down toward the convoy's rear, and leading them, unmistakable even at a distance, was Dakota. The convoy was caught in a perfect pincer. Guards who had been focused on the Apache attack now found themselves fighting on two fronts. Eleanor saw Dakota leap from his horse onto a prison wagon, his tomahawk flashing as he attacked the lock mechanism. She spurred her own horse toward the nearest wagon, where terrified captives pressed against the bars. A guard rose up to stop her, but her hours of practice paid off. She drew and fired in one smooth motion, the man spinning away, clutching his arm. "Stand back!" she yelled to the prisoners, then fired at the lock. It took 3 shots, but the mechanism shattered. The door swung open, and captives poured out. Native women and children, a few Mexican traders, even a Chinese family caught in the slavers' net. "Run to the rocks!" Eleanor shouted, pointing toward cover. "Go!" A rifle bullet tugged at her sleeve, reminding her she was still in the fight. She turned to see young Tommy, the conflicted guard from before, aiming at her with shaking hands. Their eyes met, and she saw his internal struggle written plainly on his face. "Don't do this, Tommy," she called out. "You know this is wrong. You've always known." For a moment, he wavered. Then Creed's voice cut through the chaos. "Shoot her, boy, or I'll shoot you." Tommy's face crumpled, but he lowered his rifle. The choice cost him. Creed's bullet took him in the back, and he fell forward into the dust. Eleanor felt rage surge through her. Even their own weren't safe from these monsters. She rode hard toward Creed's position, but found her path blocked by 3 guards. They raised their weapons, certain of an easy kill. Then Lakota was there, appearing like a spirit of vengeance. His tomahawk took 1 man down. His knife found another. The third, faced with the fury of a Lakota warrior, broke and ran. "Eleanor!" Dakota's voice carried surprise and something else. Was it joy? "You fight with warriors now?" "I had a good teacher," she called back, thinking of his words about her being a warrior woman. "The chains are broken, remember?" They fought side by side then, covering each other as they moved from wagon to wagon, freeing captives. Eleanor had never felt anything like this. The terror and exhilaration of battle mixed with the righteous fury of striking back at those who traded in human misery. The tide was turning decisively. Many guards had fled or fallen, and the freed captives were joining the fight, using rocks, stolen weapons, anything they could find. Eleanor saw 2 native women drag a guard from his horse, their faces masks of vengeance for whatever horrors they'd endured. But Creed wasn't finished. From somewhere, he'd procured a scattergun, devastating at close range. He emerged from cover, the weapon aimed at a group of fleeing children. "No!" Eleanor didn't think, just acted. She drove her horse directly at him, firing as she rode. Her bullet struck the wagon behind him, driving him back, but he swung the scattergun toward her. The blast was deafening. Eleanor felt the horse scream and stumble. She kicked free of the stirrups as the animal went down, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through her ankle. The old iron cuff had twisted in the fall, cutting deep. Creed advanced, reloading his weapon. "Should have stayed in your cage, girl. Would have been safer." Eleanor tried to rise, but her injured ankle buckled. She reached for her pistol, found it gone, lost in the fall. Creed smiled, savoring the moment. "You cost me a fortune," he said conversationally, as if they were discussing business over tea. "Thornton put a $1,000 bounty on your head, dead or alive, though I think I'll enjoy making it dead." He raised the scattergun. Eleanor's hand found her knife, but she knew she'd never throw it in time. This was how it ended then. In the dust of Devil's Pass, at least she'd die free, fighting. At least others had been saved. The shot never came. Instead, Creed's eyes went wide, looking down at the arrow shaft protruding from his chest. He turned, confused, to see Lakota with his bow still raised. A second arrow followed the first, and Josiah Creed fell backward. His reign of terror finally ended. Lakota was beside her in an instant, checking her injuries. "Ankle bad, but not broken," he diagnosed. "Can you ride?" "If you help me up." As he lifted her, Eleanor found herself looking into his face, really looking for the first time since the battle began. There was a new scar along his jaw, but his eyes held the same strength she remembered. "You came back. Apache runners found us. When I heard slavers in Devil's Pass," he paused, something shifting in his expression. "When I heard white woman warrior rides with Apache, I knew. Had to be you." Around them, the battle was ending. The surviving guards had surrendered or fled. Freed captives were being helped by Apache and Lakota warriors. Wounds tended. Chains struck off. Eleanor saw one elderly native man weeping as he embraced what must have been his daughter. freed from captivity. "This is what victory looks like," she murmured. "One victory," Dakota corrected gently. "Many more battles ahead. Slavers like snakes. Cut off one head, two more grow." He was right. Eleanor knew Creed was dead. But there were others like him. Thornton was still out there, and he wouldn't give up easily. The papers that made her property in the eyes of white law still existed somewhere. She touched the iron cuffs on her ankles. Even with Creed dead, she still wore the marks of slavery. But for now, in this moment, they had won. Families were reunited. Chains were broken. And she had discovered something profound about herself. She was no longer someone things happened to. She was someone who made things happen. "Your people," she said to Dakota as he helped her to a captured horse. "Will they be angry you came to fight alongside Apache? Some, perhaps, but my chief, he understands. Evil that enslaves one people will enslave all. Better to fight together than fall separately." He paused, then added quietly, "Besides, I tell them about white woman who risks life for Lakota warrior. They curious to know more of this story." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the desert sun. It's not much of a story. Woman gets captured. Warrior breaks her chains. Woman learns to fight. Simple. Nothing simple about breaking chains. Dakota said seriously, "Outside chains, inside chains, both hard to break. You break both." As they prepared to leave Devil's Pass, the freed captives going various ways with different warrior groups, Eleanor found herself at a crossroads. The Apache offered her continued sanctuary with Grandmother Moon. Some of the freed Mexican traders invited her to travel south with them, away from UAS's territory and its slave laws. But Dakota's offer was different. "Come north," he said simply. "Meet my people. Learn our ways as you learned Apache ways. Then decide where your path leads." Eleanor looked around Devil's Pass one last time. Bodies of slavers lay where they'd fallen. She felt no remorse for them. They'd chosen to traffic in human misery and paid the price. The prison wagons sat empty, doors hanging open like broken teeth. The chains that had bound so many lay scattered in the dust, some still bearing dried blood from the wrists and ankles they'd encircled. She thought of her father, killed defending their little homestead. He'd wanted her to have a simple life, marriage to a local boy, children, church on Sundays. That life had died with him, and the Eleanor who might have lived it had died in chains. But perhaps that was as it should be. The frontier was changing, old ways dying, new ones being born in blood and struggle. She was part of that change now, whether she'd chosen it or not. "North," she decided, meeting Dakota's eyes. "I'll ride north with you." His smile was like sunrise after the longest night. As they rode out together, leading some of the freed captives who chose to seek refuge with the Lakota. Eleanor touched the medicine pouch at her throat. She'd thought it was for protection, but now she understood it meant more. It was connection. To Dakota. To his people. To all who fought against chains, both literal and figurative. The battle for Devil's Pass was over, but Eleanor knew the war for freedom, her own and others, had just begun. And for the first time since that terrible night at the homestead, she was eager to face whatever came next. The journey north took them through lands that shifted from desert to grassland, from barren rock to rolling hills covered in autumn gold. Eleanor rode beside Dakota, her ankle wrapped but healing, the iron cuffs still a constant weight but no longer a symbol of captivity. Behind them traveled 15 freed souls, mostly women and children who had nowhere else to go, who chose the uncertain welcome of the Lakota over the certainty of recapture elsewhere. They moved carefully, avoiding main trails and settlements. Though Creed was dead, the network of slavers remained, and Eleanor knew Thornton wouldn't abandon his pursuit easily. She was property in his eyes, an investment gone wrong that pride demanded he recover. On the 5th day, they reached the edge of Lakota territory. Dakota called a halt at a ridge overlooking a vast valley where a river wound like a silver serpent through yellowing cottonwoods. "There," he pointed to smoke rising in the distance. "My people's winter camp." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Fighting alongside warriors was one thing. Entering their village as a white woman was another. "What if they reject me?" "Then you leave," Dakota said simply. "But they will not, my chief, Red Cloud. He judged people by actions, not skin. You fought to free our people. This matters." As they descended into the valley, riders emerged from the camp to meet them. Eleanor recognized the mixture of joy and wariness on their faces. Joy at Dakota's return. Suspicion at the white woman riding beside him. Words flew in Lakota, too fast for her to follow with her limited understanding. But she heard her name several times, and Devil's Pass, and saw how the riders' expressions shifted from suspicion to curiosity. The village was larger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 200 lodges arranged in careful circles, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing between the teepees despite the autumn chill. People emerged to witness their arrival, a sea of faces that made Eleanor acutely aware of her pale skin and matted blonde hair. An elderly man approached, his bearing commanding despite his years. Eagle feathers adorned his graying hair, and his eyes held the weight of leadership. This had to be Red Cloud. Dakota dismounted and spoke rapidly in Lakota, gesturing to Eleanor and the freed captives. Red Cloud listened without interruption, his weathered face revealing nothing. When Dakota finished, the chief's gaze fixed on Eleanor. "You are the woman who broke a warrior's chains," he said in careful English, "who fought at Devil's Pass, who rides with iron still on her ankles because she chose freedom over comfort." Eleanor slid from her horse, standing as straight as her injured ankle allowed. "I am, though it was Dakota who broke my chains first. I only returned the favor." Red Cloud studied her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "Come, we will talk. But first, we feast. Warriors returning victorious must be honored." The feast that night was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced. She sat with the women initially, feeling out of place despite their attempts to make her welcome. They examined her iron ankle cuffs with knowing looks. Some bore scars from similar restraints. One woman, seeing Eleanor struggle with the unfamiliar food, showed her how to eat properly, laughing gently at her clumsy attempts. Later, Dakota found her by one of the fires. "You do well, many watching, judging, but you show respect. This important." "I feel like I'm walking on thin ice," Eleanor admitted. "One wrong move and I'll fall through. Ice only thin if you stomp. Walk gently, with awareness, and it holds." As the evening wore on, stories were told of the battle at Devil's Pass. Eleanor understood enough to know they were being generous in their telling of her role. When pressed to share her own version, she stood nervously before the gathered people. "I know only a little of your language," she began in carefully practiced Lakota before switching to English, with Dakota translating. "But I know this, chains are chains. Whether on red skin or white, those who put them on others are enemies of all free people. I fought not as white woman trying to be Indian, but as human being who learned the weight of iron bonds." She touched her ankle cuffs. "I still wear mine because in my world, I am property, but here, among you, I hope to be just Eleanor, who stands with those who fight for freedom." The response was mixed. Some nodded approval. Others remained skeptical. But Red Cloud raised his hand for silence. "You will stay as our guest through winter. Learn our ways, our language. In spring, we decide together what path forward. This fair?" Eleanor agreed gratefully. Winter was coming, and even if they ultimately rejected her, she'd have time to heal and plan. The following weeks passed in a blur of learning. Eleanor was given space in the lodge of an elderly woman named White Buffalo Woman, who had lost her own daughters to disease. The arrangement suited both. Eleanor helped with daily tasks while learning the intricate social fabric of Lakota life. She discovered that her assumptions about savage life were laughably wrong. The Lakota had complex laws, deep spiritual traditions, sophisticated understanding of their environment. Children were educated, elders respected, decisions made through careful counsel rather than tyranny. Dakota visited daily, teaching her language and customs, but always with others present. Eleanor understood. Propriety mattered here as much as in any white town, perhaps more, because every action reflected not just on her but on him for bringing her. The iron cuffs remained a problem. The camp's metal worker tried to remove them but lacked proper tools. Each failed attempt left deeper cuts, and White Buffalo Woman finally insisted they stop before causing permanent damage. "Some chains," she said wisely, "must be worn until the right moment to remove them comes." Winter arrived with shocking suddenness. One day, autumn gold. The next, a blizzard that turned the world white. Eleanor learned to appreciate the ingenious design of the teepees. Warm and stable, despite howling winds. She mastered the art of keeping fires burning through long nights, of preserving food, of the thousand small skills that meant survival on the harsh plains. But peace couldn't last. One frozen morning, scouts brought word that made Eleanor's blood chill. A large group of white men had been seen 2 days south, asking questions about a white woman with scarred ankles living among the Lakota. "Thornton," Eleanor breathed. "He's still hunting me." Red Cloud called a council. The debate was heated. Some argued for moving camp immediately, others for standing and fighting. Eleanor listened with growing despair. Her presence endangered everyone who'd shown her kindness. "I'll leave," she announced. Standing, "This is my trouble, not yours." "Sit," Red Cloud commanded. "Running in winter is death. Besides, you are guest. We do not throw guests to wolves, 2-legged or 4. But Eleanor could see the strain her presence caused. Young warriors argued about the wisdom of harboring a white woman who brought trouble. Mothers worried for their children if fighting came. Even those who supported her looked troubled. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor found Dakota standing guard at the camp's edge. Snow fell softly around them, muffling the world. "I've brought danger to your people," she said quietly. "That's poor repayment for their kindness." "Danger already here." Dakota replied, "Men like Thornton, they take our land, kill buffalo, steal our children for their schools. You just excuse they use now. Without you, they find another. But, Eleanor," he turned to face her fully, "you think we fight for you only? No, we fight idea that people can be owned. Today they hunt you, tomorrow they hunt us. Same fight, same enemy." His words echoed what she'd felt at Devil's Pass, that all their struggles were connected, that freedom was indivisible. But knowing this didn't ease her guilt at bringing trouble to those who'd sheltered her. A shout from another guard ended their conversation. Riders approaching, but not from the south. These came from the east, moving fast despite the snow. As they drew closer, Eleanor recognized the lead rider, one of Grandmother Moon's Apache friends. His news was stunning. Thornton was dead, killed in a dispute with Mexican traders he'd tried to cheat. His men had scattered, the bounty on Eleanor withdrawn. But more importantly, he'd brought papers, documents taken from Thornton's belongings. Eleanor stared at the water-stained pages, her bill of sale, the document that made her property. With shaking hands, she held it to the fire, watching her enslavement turn to ash and smoke. She was still wanted for escaping, still wore the iron cuffs. But the man who'd claimed to own her was gone. "Now what?" she asked the dawn sky. The answer came from an unexpected source. White Buffalo Woman, who rarely spoke in council, stood before the gathered people. "This woman came to us in chains. She fought beside our warriors, lived through winter, learned our ways. The white man who hunted her is dead. I say she has earned the right to choose. Stay as one of us, or go with our blessing. But choose as free woman, not as fugitive." The vote was close, but in the end, acceptance won. Eleanor could stay if she wished, not as eternal guest, but as adopted member of the tribe. The ceremony was simple but moving. White Buffalo Woman claimed her as daughter, giving her a Lakota name that translated to "breaks her own chains." But even as Eleanor celebrated, she knew this wasn't her final destination. The frontier was changing rapidly. Railroads pushed ever westward. Towns sprouted like mushrooms after rain. and the free life of the Plains Indians was under siege. She'd found sanctuary here, found strength and purpose, maybe even found love in Dakota's steady presence. But her fight against those who would enslave others wasn't over. Standing beside Dakota as spring dawn broke over the valley, Eleanor touched the medicine pouch at her throat. The iron cuffs still circled her ankles. She'd decided to keep them as reminder and warning, but they no longer defined her. "What you thinking?" Dakota asked. Eleanor smiled, her hand finding his. "I'm thinking the world is vast and full of people in chains. And I'm thinking a warrior woman who speaks both worlds might have work to do." "Dangerous work," he warned. "Yes," she agreed, squeezing his hand. "But necessary. Will you help me?" His answer was in his eyes before he spoke. "Always." As the sun climbed higher, painting the world in shades of gold and possibility, Eleanor Whitfield, once slave, now warrior, forever free, began planning her next battle in the long war against those who would put others in chains. The frontier was wild and dangerous and full of injustice, but it was also full of people willing to fight for freedom. And as long as they stood together, there was hope. The chains were broken. Now it was time to help break others. Thank you so much for listening to this story of courage and freedom in the Wild West. I'm curious to know where in the world you're enjoying this tale. Please share in the comments below. If you've been moved by Eleanor and Dakota's journey, don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let us know your thoughts about their story. What did you think of Eleanor's transformation? Would you have made the same choices? Share your reflections with our community of Western story lovers.